Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sarah Derdowski. I'm the Executive Director of the Global Energy Management Program here at CU Denver. We're excited to have you all as a part of our On the Road to Energy Transformation series. This is the second part of that series, focusing on electrification and supply chain impacts. We're so honored to have our two panelists with us here today, Jill Ingle-Cox and Natasha Herring. So thanks to you both for being our expert panelists today. We're just going to give everybody just a few minutes to make sure they're jumping on the call, just the next minute here, and then we will get kicked off. 30 seconds or so, and then we'll get moving on to our questions. And perfect. So we're excited, as I mentioned, to have this to be the second part of our web series. It's something that we think is very important to do for our community, which is have public education as part of our mission. And so this is the second part of a three-part series. The first one really focused on markets. This one's focusing a little bit more on the electrification and the supply chain side and how COVID has impacted that or transformed that sector. And then the third part is going to be more specifically on the strategy side, how this has obviously been a black swan event at multiple levels for the energy sector. And so we want to have some key takeaways of lessons learned, as well as maybe how we can plan for some of these uncertain times in the future. And so one of the reasons we wanted to do this, as I mentioned, is we're part of a public institution, and it's part of our mission to put information and education out there to our community, which are our stakeholders, which is the business community, our students, alumni, but also the wider public at large. And so that's really the purpose we're serving here. So one of the things I wanted just to mention briefly is that we've kind of focused on three areas here at CU Denver in our energy programming. We focus on graduate education, professional energy education, and public education. And that piece is really important because I know in the energy sector right now, it can be tough times depending on where you sit, but there's also a lot of opportunity. And I also encourage people who have a lot of time on their hands right now to really think about how either you can retool where your skill sets fit in, and that we have a lot of offerings for you, whether it's free all the way to the professional level, and a lot of hybrid and online. And we just want to let you know we're here to support you, whether it's through webinars or any different levels of education. So just a little plug there. So please stay tuned for anything we can share, or let us know if there are topics or areas that you think you would like to learn about. With that, I want to make sure to introduce our distinguished speakers today. So I'm going to give you a little bit of their bios, but I'm certainly going to let them introduce themselves as well. And then right before I kick it off to them and hand it over, do have a quick poll question just to make sure everybody is engaging or paying attention, but also so we can have a great conversation. So let's just scroll here. I don't want to miss anything. I know these two ladies very well, but just want to make sure we cover all their high-level credentials. So our first is Jill Ingle-Cox. So she's the director of the JISEA Institute out at NREL, which is the Joint Institute for Strategic Energy Analysis, which I rarely remember the full acronym, what it means. So she has over 25 years of experience in energy, and that's from renewables to oil and gas. So she's an engineer by trade and training, but has really diversified from that more technical role into a much more strategic level all over the years, and worked across the globe, spending a lot of time in the Middle East and Asia. And I think it's a great story that she kind of kicked off her career a little bit, kind of climbing wind turbines and doing that. And now she's doing research here at NREL in Colorado, which we're honored to have her on there. She also guest lectures at Johns Hopkins, and then for us here at the Global Energy Management Program as one of our instructors. So Jill, thanks so much for being on the call today. And then we also have Natasha Herring. So she is a senior consultant. She's an engineer at Guidehouse now, formerly Navigant. And so she sits on their clean energy programs team, has over 5 years of industry experience doing the more evaluation and measurements. She has strong feelings about STEM education for women and girls, which we're really supportive of. And she is also an alumni of the Global Energy Management Program here with her master's. So that's very exciting. So to kick the webinar off, I'd like to just let you guys know, the way we'll do it is we'll have them, I'll have Jill and Tasha give some brief remarks at the very beginning, and then we'll go into our question and answer session. But what I would like to do is really have everyone think of their questions as they come along and put them in the chat box. I think it's much more relevant if we have the conversation when that point was made as opposed to the end. And so we'll do that, but I will stop us 10 minutes before as well, if there were any additional comments or questions that we didn't answer along the way. So let me stop sharing the screen here. Perfect. And so let me get to my poll question, and then we will get started. So poll. So I'm just going to launch that quickly, give everyone just a quick moment to see what responses are. Interesting. And then I will end it and share the results. All right. Interesting. All right. And panelists, I'm not sure if you can see the poll yet or not, but I'm going to end it. And I am going to, so overall, just the quick question was, how has COVID-19 crisis affected our electricity profile? Interestingly, it's almost split half and half, that folks say it is increased demand, the other half says it's decreased demand, and the small contingent says it's remained the same. So just wanted to take a quick poll so everybody can see that. Great. All right, so I'm going to stop sharing, close that. And great, so excited to get to questions here. So to kick us off, Jill, let's start with you. Please feel free to mention anything I've missed in your bio. You have a very distinguished career here at NREL, and I want to make sure we cover all of that. And then maybe just give us a quick 3 to 5 high-level overview. We'll get into the details in a little bit of how the electrification world is changing from where you sit at the federal level, but also the research perspectives that you bring from NREL.
Great, thank you very much, Sarah. I'm very happy to be here. And very happy to participate in this program. Just as Sarah mentioned, I teach for the GEM program at CU Denver, which is a great opportunity to engage with energy professionals from around the world. As she mentioned in my bio, I work at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. The background behind me is our wind test site, where we actually test full-scale wind turbines and how they connect to the grid, and how renewables and hydrogen and other types of energy systems do grid connection. And this connects to our supercomputer, where we are studying electrification, both where we are now and where we might go in the future. The institute I lead, the Joint Institute for Strategic Energy Analysis, our focus is the intersection of renewables and other different types of sectors. So we're looking at how renewables intersect with natural gas, with nuclear power, with agriculture, manufacturing, and industry. So I'll be pulling on some of that experience in some of my comments going forward. So in my few minutes here to talk a little bit about kind of where we are in electrification. Electricity in the U.S., the electricity demand in the U.S. has basically been flat over the past few decades. And even though we have a lot more that we're plugging in, our efficiency gains have been tremendous in terms of the types of appliances we're using, the types of better efficient buildings, better efficient industries, and that has really offset the potential increase of electricity that we would have experienced with all the computers and laptops and other things that we're using. But we have the potential for a really significant change going forward. And this is particularly if we start to look at electrifying some of the major sectors. And so at NREL, we are studying this in a program called the Electrification Future Study. It's a multi-report study that has, the first 3 reports have come out, and there's several more to go. And in that study, we are looking at 3 areas: transportation, industry, and residential and commercial, and what the potential is for electrification for those. Currently, our transportation sector is almost 0% electric, even if a few of us do own electric cars, except for some public transit and EVs. But there's, a potential for light duty vehicles, buses, and a few other large vehicles going electric. So in our electrification future studies, we project that at the high end, you could have up to 75% of light duty vehicles being electrified. So we'd love to think about there about where do we charge those vehicles? When are they going to be putting demand on the grid? How is that really going to significantly change? On the residential commercial side, so that's buildings, that's largely around space heating and water heating. Currently, that is a largely natural gas market. All new builds are often electric, but there's still a large residual for natural gas heating in buildings. So all of that is technically possible to electrify now, but there is some there's a lot of turnover and a lot of consumer acceptance experience that Natasha's going to talk a little bit about. And then the third area I want to mention is industry, which is really the hardest. Industry has high demands for process heat in particular. So that's for curing, drying, boiling, pumping, fans, all these things that are not currently electrified. And this equipment life is very long, so it's going to take a very long to have this turnover to electrification. So there may be other options there that we may have to look at besides moving to electricity. So in that study, our electricity looks at up to 20%, up to 38% electricity demand growth, particularly in transportation. This would basically double the share of electricity is in our final energy consumption from 20% to 40%. But even if you look at that rate of growth, it is not beyond what we have experienced in the past. And it may result in really a more efficient system. But really, we don't know the exact way, so that we're going to go forward. So we look at lots of different scenarios and what the technical options are there, what the economic challenges are, and then where we have to develop new technologies, particularly for industry, to develop either electricity options or other options in clean fuels.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Jill. And then Natasha, I'd love to hear from you. Anything I left out in the bio? And then again, you bring a different perspective from the consultant side. So maybe kind of what you're hearing from your clients, and then maybe how that conversation has changed over the last 2 months or so since COVID has hit the market.
Right. Hello, everybody. My name is Natasha Herring. As Sarah mentioned, I'm a happy and proud GEM alumni. So glad to be connected and glad to be back and helping. I work at Guidehouse. I sit in the energy, sustainability, and infrastructure practice. And so specifically, that means I work a lot with utilities and utility customers, utility programs, mostly on the residential, commercial, and industrial space. And so that's kind of my background. And I think this is an interesting conversation. I think as far as trends that I'm seeing, I think on one side, there's customers, right? And the customers are gaining a lot of awareness about where energy is coming from, where is their power coming from, how can they be a part of the solution even? So we have, customers installing solar, looking in and installing electric vehicles, other smart technologies, whether that's thermostats, kind of other, efficient light bulbs, things around the house, or that are in their control where they can make a difference. And I think that's awesome. And I think that's going to continue to grow. It has been growing, and it will continue to grow. And then I think on the utility side, we're seeing a lot more utilities wanting to better understand their customers, whether that's when are they using power, what are their interests, what do they need kind of from an energy perspective. I think it's less from, I need power, giving power, but like, what else do you need? What are you using power for specifically? How can we design programs and technologies to better serve kind of the specific needs of customers? So I do think it's kind of this coming together of customers gaining more knowledge and awareness, and is also utilities kind of trying to be more of a partner. And I think even with coronavirus now coming up, a lot more customers have received utility emails, or information about ways that they can reduce energy, or kind of push these demand side management programs awareness. I think sometimes energy efficiency has been looked at as a smaller piece of the energy puzzle. And I think, that's fair in some respects, but there are huge gains. And now that people are home, it's really an opportune time to, make sure that everything in your home is upgraded and efficient. And so I think there's a couple different considerations when I think about overall trends. One is education. I just talked about how customers are becoming more educated, but I do think there's a lot of disparity in there. You have a lot of customers or a handful of customers that know a lot about electric vehicles and are purchasing and have, availability and access to do that. But there's a lot of the general public that doesn't know a lot about the utility industry. All they do is see their bill, and it went up, it went down. And so I think the education, I guess there needs to be a little bit of a leveling field when it comes to education. And second is access. I do think there are gains to be made in the industry when it comes to access, just thinking about who can install solar, multifamily buildings, or different condo, arrangements where access to kind of being a part of the solution, being a part of this maybe energy transformation may not be as accessible to all customers, as well as cost. We have some pioneers that are willing to fit the bill to, get this equipment installed, but who's gonna pay those maintenance, those recurring, the infrastructure cost? And that's, no one wants to pay that bill. And then finally, regulation. We have to remember that many utilities are heavily regulated, and while there are really important global issues like climate change, I'm sure we'll talk about, and some other things, but those aren't the only issue on the table. It's not a private company. They can't just pick up and change direction. They have to be accountable to stakeholders, to the public utilities commissions, to their customers. So it's really a complex industry and has some unique challenges, but I'm excited to see kind of what this new period of coronavirus, what new innovations come out of this period of distress.
Yeah, and I think you made a lot of really good points, Natasha. I know we'll kind of dive deeper into a few of them as we go along, but one of the things I liked that you mentioned is that, I think people are a little bit more aware now that they're at home, right? So, and I think, Jill, you recognize that as well. It's like, suddenly you're like, oh, maybe I can upgrade, do some energy efficiency work. I'm realizing, oh, my house might be more drafty than I thought, or I haven't upgraded my light bulbs, and things like that do make a big difference along the way. Because energy efficiency, as we say, is not sexy, but it's the best energy is the energy we don't use, right? So absolutely, I think people are more aware, and this is a good opportunity to increase the awareness there. Jill, I know you hit already a little bit on some of the technical and economic impacts, or technical and economic potential that we have in the electrification sector, but anything else you want to elaborate on those pieces? I know we have those main sectors. The transportation is a big one, but any further elaboration on those?
So again, transportation's really been a really big focus on electrification, specifically around because we are seeing advancements in electric vehicles. They are about 2% of the sales of new vehicles in the U.S., even higher in other countries. And I think the big challenges that we're really focused on with transportation as we see this electrification is, as I mentioned, is how is that going to integrate into the grid? How are utilities, if we get a very high percentage of electric vehicles into the market, how are utilities going to deal with the changing in the charging infrastructure? Are you going to have it distributed? Are people going to be charging at home or at work? And then how are you going to incentivize people to charge when there is excess electricity and you don't end up with these very high peak and ramp rates of electricity demand in very strange locations? The other thing I think, and I mentioned this a little bit, so this gets away from electrification a little bit, but the importance of, especially in the industrial sector, on on liquid fuels and the need for process heat. So liquid fuels are really an amazing storage technology. So if you look at natural gas, for example, it's very energy dense. It works with existing, we've got an infrastructure to use it. And in some cases, you're going to need to continue to have these types of fuels for, again, high process heat. It's very difficult to use solar photovoltaics or wind turbines to generate the types of heat for a steel mill or a cement plant, for example. So we're doing research on technologies that's looking at using electricity to generate hydrogen. When you have very low cost electricity that you, because there's not a high demand, so for example, electricity market has seen electricity prices go to zero, just as we're seeing, and negative, just as we're seeing the oil and gas, the gas market now experiencing. We can use those electrons when we have them at low cost to do a process called electrolysis, where you're water splitting to create hydrogen. And then that hydrogen is able to be stored. And then that can be either converted back into electricity, or it can be combusted for process heat in an industrial process. We're also looking at technologies where you can actually capture CO2 off of a plant that's combusting coal or oil and gas, or just producing CO2 from its natural process, combining that with a hydrogen, clean green hydrogen, and then basically create a synthetic methane or green methane that you can use through the pipelines through existing infrastructure. Mm-hmm. So the advantage is that, that uses existing infrastructure, using existing systems, but yet, and it actually fills that niche for heat, but yet it is created through electricity or through other green, potentially renewable processes. So those are the types of things that we're looking at to address those hard to decarbonize, hard to electrify processes.
Yeah, and then I did get a question, Jill, from Pat from our audience. He's interested in electrification of the transport area as well. He says electrification of transportation cleans up emissions by pairing with renewables. How are utilities planning on handling higher EV penetration and renewable load balancing?
Yes, so they are, utilities are looking at this closely. We are certainly not at the penetration rates that it's a big issue at this point. But they are looking at, as we're seeing, for example, utilities moving to time of use rates, which is you pay for the electricity at a different rate depending on the time of day. That will actually be very helpful when we have larger percentages of electric vehicles being charged at home, because then you're going to incentivize electric vehicle charging when you have more electricity. You're not having the high demand. So at night, right now, for example, is when you have high electricity. You have low electricity demand, but you could still be running the facilities that you have. So time of use rates are one method that utilities will use to encourage people to charge their vehicles at night or when electricity demand is low. The interesting thing is we may see a period where we've got such a significant amount of renewables, particularly solar, where you have maybe a lot of excess electricity in the middle of the day when you've got a bright, sunny, windy day and you've got sort of normal demand. You may then want to try to incentivize people to charge their vehicles or other uses at that time of day. So we're going to have to get a lot smarter in the future about dynamic pricing, where at least some people or some companies or organizations can use the low price electricity when they know it's going to be low, and to be able to that will really help levelize the demand, the supply and demand balancing through that. So I think electric vehicles present both a challenge, but they also present a great opportunity to be able to help achieve this load balancing.
Yeah, and just, a quick note, I know we talk about flattening the curve for COVID and healthcare, but, it seems like this is also helping to flatten kind of the duck curve in reverse, right? When we think of electrification at the same time. So it's kind of
the greatest risk is always when you have a very rapid increase in something and the system can't handle it, which is exactly the analogy.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's interesting. This is probably a science experiment that can never have happened on the electricity market before, to see what it's like to kind of flatten that curve while we're all at home here. So, well, great. Well, I want to jump over to Natasha. You talked a little bit, already from your client's perspective, but interested to hear a little bit more kind of the perceptions that you're hearing from your clients about this, about electrification. Are they taking this on board? Are they taking this seriously? Is this something they're heavily investing in?
Sure, and I'll start by popping in to answer part of that question too. At least, that makes me think about, when you talk about EVs, transportation, how utilities are going to respond. I feel like the utility industry is just a little bit different than maybe some other industries, because utilities really have been footing the bill for the infrastructure maintenance of, we have cars, there are roads that the federal government maintains. There are things that other industries rely on government help for maintenance, and so they can really focus on the product. And I feel like utilities are in a unique space because they are responding or responsible for maintenance of the grid, which is aging and needs a lot of help and attention. And right now, during coronavirus, is really being used heavily, right? Like utilities are actively first responders. They are, in many ways, electricity is the lifeblood of the United States. And, we're home, we expect Wi-Fi, we expect all of the, everything to be connected to power, hospitals, how they're responding. And so I guess first I just want to applaud utilities for responding and kind of like putting some of the, payment or kind of other logistical things that would be barriers to power for everyone, and really kind of coming together to put forth power first, or making sure people have access to power. And then I think when it comes to electric vehicles, this is unique because utilities, again, are responsible for the infrastructure. So it's not like the government's footing the bill and they just need to, work to connect with automakers and customers. And so I think it's just an interesting conundrum a little bit, just because of the way the industry is designed, I guess. So just popping that in, I think as far as just some other thoughts about the future, I think the future is really connected. I do think that the grid is, I expect some innovations to come in the grid. Jill talked about a handful. I think we're going to see a lot more in like DER, microgrids coming up, and even this idea of virtual power plants, which is a little bit new to me, but it's essentially a expanded control center for if a lot more, I guess it's like an advancement on the microgrid, where if a lot more people or communities have solar and electric vehicles and different electricity generating, whether it's batteries or other electricity generating items, and how those connect to the grid. I think utilities, I feel like, have a unique issue or a unique challenge ahead of them in how to integrate kind of the future as people become more aware, want to partake. How are they going to keep in line charging and control of the grid from customers now being more part of the generation, and just managing that load. So I see, I guess, a lot of innovation when it comes to controls in the future of electrification and utility management.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point. Both, you made earlier about utilities being very complex. They're very complex. It's also very old structures. Not every region has the same structures, the same regulations, the same laws, and then there's everything from an IOU to your kind of small rural power and things like that. So it's definitely a complex system, and so integrating some of these new technologies is also complicated. But I think you're right. And Jill, you might want to chime in on this too, is that it's kind of ripe for innovation at this point. It's such an old industry that's been doing things very similarly for many, many years that it really is prime for innovation and change. Guess, Jill, anything you wanted to add on kind of emerging kind of grid innovation that you're seeing or research? I know you guys are doing a lot out there at NREL. Just any studies or thing briefly you wanted to mention?
Yeah, just a lot of things. And as you mentioned, the utilities are now starting to really innovate. So we're actually working quite closely with the utilities who are thinking about what are they going to need to do this. So, smart meters, smart grids, different types of policies, different types of use rates. most utilities now have set goals for either high renewables or high decarbonization, or or high clean, depending how they want to define it. And we're trying to help them sort out what that means in terms of being able to do the modeling. And the big challenge now that we're working with the utilities to think about innovation is how do you get that last 20%? I mean, getting to 80% renewables, 80% variable renewables, even if you just look at wind and solar. How do you think about that last 20%? I mean, is it going to be hydropower? Is it going to be geothermal? Is it going to be storage? Is it going to be other types of technology? So looking at the long-term storage challenges for things, seasonal storage that you need month to month, year to year, is really some of the innovative areas that the utilities are asking for, and that people are working on to come up with solutions for that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's you hope you can innovate your way out there at the end. That's for sure. Well, Jill, kind of want to stick with you and talk a little bit more. What are some of the key features of energy technology supply chains? So we've talked, a little bit about the grid, but kind of the technology supply chains. And then what are some of the risks in those supply chains? Obviously, we're seeing some of those impacts now with COVID-19. But if you could just, mention some of those key features.
Sure. So supply chains is something that people have been looking at for quite some time. It's really important if you're in the industry, but perhaps with COVID-19, suddenly people are really aware of supply chains now. If you're trying to get hand sanitizer in the store, suddenly you're aware of how sanitizer is made and where it comes from and how it's shipped around the world. So supply chains, the short version is supply chains are global. And they're very complicated, and they really vary by technology if you're just looking at the energy technologies. So we've got some reports that we've put out. We do some deep dives on various technologies and look at the supply chains. So if you start at the front end of supply chains for energy technologies, the raw materials, this is an area that's frequently mentioned around renewables. Those are global. You get cobalt from Africa for batteries, lithium from South America, rare earth elements from China, copper and aluminum from North America, and then those are processed in different countries. So often they're shipped as some lightly processed ore, and then they're refined in another place. For example, silicon is largely refined. It's got large refineries in the United States and Germany. Then those refined minerals are sent to be made into components or subcomponents, and then assembled into the final energy technologies. And often that, so for example, for PV, while the polysilicon is in the US and Europe, then it gets sent to Asia, where it's made into ingots and cells and modules, which then may get sent back to North America, where they are assembled and then installed on someone's roof or on a utilities plant. So very few things are made in one place all the way end to end. Wind turbine blades are frequently made locally where they're used. But a lot of the little components in the nacelles, in the turbine part, are globally sourced. So with COVID, what we saw on renewables specifically is that some of the manufacturing plants did stop production, particularly in Asia. They also potentially had reduced access to raw materials. The shipping was disrupted. Some plants continued to produce. So First Solar, for example, continued to produce in its plants in Malaysia and Ohio. Other plants, such as China, completely stopped. SunPower's facilities stopped for a few weeks, and these are all just kind of coming back up now. So we saw some of the same behavior as we're seeing with people in their grocery store. There was some hoarding. There was panic buying and hoarding, and then we're now potentially going to see the supply opening up. So the predictions are that either prices for panels will go down, because there's suddenly going to be a huge surplus, or that they're going to go up because there's going to be a shortage, or they're going to stay the same. I mean, in the past decade, we've seen continuous decline of panel prices on a per watt basis. We think that will happen. We don't know with supply chain. So there's a lot of challenges around the technology supply chain right now, and a lot of uncertainty. And then finally, one little final bit on this is that we're seeing potential slowdown in construction of new facilities, not so much in 2020, but potentially in 2021, because a lot of the new The financing for the projects that will be constructed in 9 to 18 months have been put on hold, more due to the economic side than the supply chain side. So that may suppress demand for the technologies going forward, which may also then suppress prices. So a lot of uncertainty really around the supply chain with the COVID reactions. So I'll stop there for now.
No, absolutely. I think people before kind of knew where their supply chains were, like you said, and now certainly know where every bit of their business is coming and going from constantly. So that's, and I think, yeah, and same says for the fossil side, they certainly were also just as affected. And so,
more so.
Yeah, very much so. And so Natasha, kind of talking about that a little bit, kind of the impacts of supply chain on utility programs and customers. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So I guess from where I sit, I'm more from the demand side.
Mm-hmm.
And so, you know, for those programs that are still going, which are largely residential programs and then largely commercial dealing with HVAC programs, some of the other programs have just slowed down. There's just not a lot of demand for them. But for large HVAC programs, we're seeing, you know, just delays, you know, where before getting a new HVAC system might have taken 3 weeks, 4 weeks, now, you know, are delayed 8, 10, 12 weeks. Just kind of, as Jill mentioned, there's different parts that comes from different countries, and especially those equipment that's made in Europe and Asia. It's just those delays. So we are seeing some of those. I think it's hard to tell at this moment what the impact is, right? Obviously, a customer will get their equipment late, but I think this may have other repercussions with forecasting, possibly with like not hitting a program's goals for the years or utilities like energy savings goals just because of this. So I think some of that is still yet to see. But right now it's primarily delays, and I don't think there's anything super critical at the moment because everyone's aware of what's going on, but more to tell in the future.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I did want to, because this question from the audience, I think will kind of transition us to a little bit of the comments, which are a little bit surrounding some of the climate discussion, I think, that we're hearing based on electrification right now and some opportunities and stuff that the globe really has. I can read the full thing just so you have the context for kind of what she was thinking, which is in 2019 and 2022, some insurance companies will no longer underwrite generation companies producing more than 30% of their electricity from coal. So kind of greening the grid perspective. And it said BlackRock also announced it will divest investments in companies that earn more than 25% of their revenues from thermal coal. Some say that this is the only way emissions can be reduced is for fossil fuel investments to stop and for green energy investments to be significantly boosted. How do you guys feel on that topic? Do you think that's, you know, one way that it can happen, or is that the only way?
I guess I can start.
Yeah.
I think it's one way, but not the only way. I mean, we're currently in the U.S. and in many countries, especially in Europe, are seeing the decline of coal. That might be in part due to investors, but it's really probably more so the fact that the plants are having trouble competing with low-cost natural gas power and with low-cost renewables. I mean, while renewables are more capital investment intensive to build, they have zero fuel costs and zero fuel cost risk. The sun is not going to suddenly become more expensive in the future. So that's the way that we've seen a decline in emissions on the electricity sector, in large part due to simple economics, and there's not investment because there's not as good a payout and return on investment as some of these other technologies. So in a sense, some of these announcements might hasten things along, but not completely. It's already in process.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I agree with Jill. I don't think it's the only way, but I do think, you know, money talks, and, you know, putting where you invest really is making a statement. I think now we are at an energy transition, and so I think it is important for investors to think about where, you know, they're putting their money, where they actually going to get return in 5 to 10 years. And I think the whole industry really is thinking about as well, like, you know, if they're if we are able to use, stimulus money, are we trying to just maintain the status quo, or are we really gonna, step into the future and like see how we can make climate conscious decisions and kind of like progress, I guess, our society forward in a clean manner. So I do think it is, it's definitely not the only way, but I do think it is a strong move towards more energy conscious future.
Yeah, and I guess I would concur with you guys that I think it's an economic discussion. Jill, if the economics are there, businesses are going to make that economic choice and decision as well. And we've seen, the cost of renewables, levelized costs come down dramatically, and pretty much wind and solar are competing on the open market, that level playing field with.
I think it's important to remember how we got there, though, because there is a policy element in there, and there might be an investor demand and consumer demand there, which in the sense that renewables, of course, were not the cheapest option in the beginning. And the way they got there was basically through economies of scale, being able to ramp up production to such that you're producing panels at such a low price because you're able to build large factories and build them continuously. And to do that, you need the high production, you need the high demand. And so we had a lot of policies and government policies and also corporate policies that said we are going to buy renewables, we're going to be 100% whatever, or 50% clean energy, because they made a commitment even before it was completely an economic decision, supported by government policies, and then that drove the economies of scale, which then drove the prices down, until many of the renewables can compete on an open market. So I think there's a role for investors and policy and decision makers, especially in the early stage of any new technology.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's important to note too, it's hard to do all of this without like an overall strategy of what are we trying to do, and is policy acting the same way business is acting, and are we all trying to move towards this low carbon future, and making sure that that's at the forefront. We do have another question that's going to lead us into the couple other wrap-up questions and things that we had. So going to jump to that one. It's kind of this future forward question, which is, what are the major challenges do you see in transitioning from a fuel-based endpoint energy consumption to an electricity endpoint energy consumption? And what tools can be leveraged to make this transition occur in the near and long-term time frame?
Tasha, you want to start that one?
The first thing that came to mind was infrastructure. I just think that's huge because we can have champions and pioneers, and that's great. But in order for something to be sustainable, we have to have the infrastructure and access so that everyone can buy in. And so, now we have gas stations all around. And so, seeing how, I guess we can, shift behavior and say that, we're only going to install electric vehicle chargers or in certain places, or if we're keeping kind of the same behavior that we have right now, how are we going to roll out the infrastructure at the level where, the change for consumer behavior is not large. So that's kind of the first thing that comes to mind. I think as far as tools that can be leveraged, I think there's going to need to be a lot of stakeholder conversations, as I mentioned before, and as it's come up, like regulation, Jill mentioned policy. There's just a lot of people that have a voice and have a say, and that have different opinions that have also, or different objectives that have also come up. And so I think that that needs to be a lot of conversations, and I feel like technology and the rate of technology changing can really help, I guess, either complicate or simplify kind of how that moves forward. So those are my thoughts. But infrastructure I see as the primary major challenge, and getting people kind of to move towards the big picture in a way that's complementary to one another.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I would add to that, which is related to infrastructure, is thinking about the existing companies and other major players in the economy. How are they going to manage this transition? And this is always a challenge when you have a new technologies coming over, new approaches, is that some companies are going to be able to anticipate that and be able to transform themselves into the new economy. We're starting to see some, for example, oil and gas companies that are very focused, and also their supplier companies, starting to think about what is their role going to be in a more electrified future. And they're sort of finding their way about what their current capabilities are and where they best align with that. And then and so thinking about how the companies and organizations that are really large parts of our economy are going to manage that transition and going forward, I think is really important too.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think you both make some really good points there, and Natasha, liked yours on infrastructure for sure. That's going to be a major issue, and it also highlights some of the other more complex issues of like haves and have-nots, and then how do we make sure that we are serving, especially in a electrified world. Energy poverty is so real even here in the U.S. And so as we add on more renewables, does it add on cost? Does it, as we upgrade the grid, or we look to see who's responsible, how does that add on cost, and how does that affect that direct consumer? Because we do have a lot of responsibility to them as well, and making sure we're serving them as well as folks who might have some more financial.
Yeah, and there's some interesting transition points to think about too, because say a state or a region decides to move away from natural gas for heating and other uses. At some point, so say you sort of get partway through that transition, but at some point the pipeline becomes not used enough to even be economically operated. So at some point you might have to have a sudden shut off, or you have to subsidize an existing infrastructure until you get everyone converted. So there's going to be some hiccups at various stages when everything will either have to convert very quickly, or you're going to have to understand how the infrastructure sort of connects to each other. What do you do with these sort of stranded assets?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, just two questions left here. So if anybody else has additional questions, please send them in, because I just have two questions for Jill and Natasha. And so one is, we talked about this future forward a little bit. AI is kind of the big buzzword that's out there. So wondering, is there any potential for AI to help kind of mitigate some of the supply chain risks that we have? And if so, what does that look like, and what do those conditions look like that would be useful? I'll pitch it to both of you.
I can start. I think that there are innovations yet to be made. I think AI, just technology in general, drones, other things that can definitely be used to either do maintenance on the grid, update. I feel like there's a culture shift, I think, happening because it has to for coronavirus, but that might actually come in the next couple of years when it comes to just the way that we even operate the grid, and the way that remote learning or remote working, are gonna, I guess, come in. And so I am expectant for innovation to come to the energy industry. I don't have any specific ideas per se, but I do think there are grand opportunities for IA, for technology, for innovation to come.
Yeah.
Yeah, just building on that maybe a little bit. AI, autonomous vehicles or autonomous operations, increased automation. That's going to continue. That's been going on for a long time. Thinking about the COVID example, the more you have automation and things operating with robots and other types of AI, you have less worker exposure. Workers can work from more remotely and be able to continue manufacturing, except for cases where maybe you needed to correct a problem. These types of innovations could lead us to both in this current health crisis, but also, for example, mining could largely be done autonomously and would have much better worker health outcomes if you had somebody operating mining equipment with a joystick from a nice office, as opposed to being underground or in a large open pit mine. So, mining is not going to go away. We're going to need it for for all technology futures. And so thinking about how AI can minimize that risk, and minimize and improve jobs and improve life for workers overall.
Yeah, it's it also goes back to that piece, Jill, that you mentioned earlier. You said, things aren't all manufactured in one place as well. And so maybe some of this can help us do that, keep it more centralized. But then also, I think about, I have some friends who work in nuclear power plants. And if any of that can use AI to kind of increase employee safety, but just overall safety in general on how things are done and managed. I think that's huge potential there. We're just kind of keeping with that theme of what does our future look like? What are the risks and opportunities for the energy future? Whether it's economic, environmental, social, cultural, there's so many different aspects to it, but what are some of the risks and opportunities you guys are seeing for kind of the future of energy?
Well, I guess I'll start. I think I'll start with the risk, because that way I'll end up on the positive. I think one of the risks is that we're going to replace one massive energy system with another massive energy system. And we need to take, so we're going to take this oil and gas, coal-based system, and we may be replacing it with a renewables electricity-based system. Now, obviously, this won't happen overnight, and it's never going to go to zero. We still burn wood for various things, so we didn't get rid of past fuel sources. But if we're going to replace one massive energy system with another, we have to think about what the future effects might be of that, even if we don't know what those effects might be. So with renewable energy, there's a lot of concern about raw materials and the input materials. And so we need to be thinking now about how to develop the technologies to minimize the use of hazardous materials, to minimize the impact from mining, to minimize the impact from supply chains issues. We need to be thinking about land use and how we can co-crop land use. We're looking at how you have agriculture and renewables working together, in developing ways to make sure that we don't have the same negative impacts. Just as we went from horses and the extreme pollution that they created in cities and urban areas in the late 1800s, and we ended up putting out all sorts of air pollution instead, what is going to be the effect from this transition to new technologies? And I think we need to be able to think about that and face it early, and then mitigate it before it becomes a major issue. That said, in terms of the opportunities, there's a huge opportunity for us to have cleaner air, cleaner water, better use of land, more locally generated energy, more resilient energy, because it's more networked and connected together. People will have more control over their energy demand and their energy use, and be able to optimize it for their own uses, their communities, their countries, and going forward. So I think there's an amazing, bright future out there, as long as we're very careful in the transition.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I'll chime in. I think that on the risk side, especially social, cultural, I think, we have a large energy industry and a lot of institutional knowledge. And I feel like pending kind of what happens over the next couple of weeks, a couple of months, we've already experienced a lot of layoffs. I feel like institutional knowledge, we don't know what's going to ramp up, if it's solar renewables, we don't know what's going to happen with oil and gas. I just feel like there's a large risk in the institutional knowledge that the industry has or is losing, or might lose temporarily and then need to bounce back. And so I think that's one that's pretty big, and even getting people on board with like how technology, how I guess the business works, and then I think just the unknown. I mean, the forecasts, it's hard to tell what's going to happen on the utility side, on consumption, usage, what's going to happen in the industry, kind of in every different sector. And I think that's just a huge risk. We do know that the energy transition, I guess, is here, or it's coming, and this is an opportune time. But how things are going to end up at the end, I guess, is a big risk. But I do think there is a risk of not doing anything. And so I think that also, if you're not a part, not active, not kind of learning, trying to understand, kind of see what you can do, I think that is a huge risk as well. And I love how Jill pointed out the land. Yesterday was Earth Day. I'm like, wow, it's an interesting perspective. We are like, just thinking about the earth and how we've used it in the past and the future to come. And so just to echo Jill's points on opportunities, I feel like this is really the time to seize kind of this energy transition. This is really a time to maybe even accelerate some of the plans that maybe were drawn out over the next 15 to 30 years for businesses, for utilities, to make more climate conscious decisions. This is the time now. Why not use this time, use the funds, use this setback, a global setback in some respects to prepare for the future and to make those significant changes so that our future can be cleaner sooner. So I think that's a huge opportunity, huge time for innovation.
Yeah, and those are great points. And they kind of speak to, we did have a couple of quick questions come in, but I think they kind of lend to kind of what you both said. David mentions, decline in drilling costs over the past few years, perhaps how can we leverage that more towards geothermal or ESG? So that's a potential, and you ladies might have some thoughts on that. And then the same Phil asked, is there any research yet, and maybe it's too soon, on the climate impact, as we shift more towards electrification, especially now with this big pause that we're having, how significant this could be, maybe if we continue to operate in this capacity or, kind of trending in that capacity. Could this, is there any research to say kind of how that's going to affect the climate? So I don't know if you guys want to add any comments on that, or
I can give you, I know we got shorter time, so I can give you flash answers on those.
Yes.
Geothermal, yes, we are. There is a potential there. I can just say that we've been contacted by a number of organizations suddenly interested in geothermal. And I've actually been saying this for a number of years. So I think this is great. It's completely different rock. It's different drill bits. It's different temperatures. There's a whole lot of technical issues, but definitely seeing an increase there, and definitely a potential. And then climate impact of mining and resource development. We've got a program. We're trying to get partners in the mining industry to come together to look at ways to power mine operations with renewable energy or other types of clean energy. So there's starting to be interest in that, in part driven from the downstream companies who are making technologies, asking for the mining companies to send them green raw materials or materials produced with low emissions. So demand from the far end asking for the upstream to change their the way they operate. So yes, we're seeing both.
Great. Natasha, any thoughts you'd like to add there?
Nothing to add there. Jill did a great job.
Well, first, I just want to thank my panelists so much for jumping on the call today and being the experts that they are in their fields. We're so excited to have you a part of the GEM community, but also to be able to be here and hear what you had to share today. So thanks for everyone for participating. Just a quick reminder, we do have part 3 of this webinar series coming up on May 7th. That's with Johanna Schmidtke. She's Managing Director at ARA, and Chase Boswell at Thunder River. So definitely, if you have an opportunity to jump on that call or jump on that webinar, we'd love to see you answer some more questions there. And then as you think about retooling, we are kind of focusing a little bit more on the big data side, since everyone's virtual these days, and then how we can leverage technology and the data that we have in the energy space. So with that, again, a big thank you to Jill and Natasha for being on the call. And then if we can ever answer any questions or provide resources for you, my contact info is there. So looking forward to seeing everyone online. So stay healthy, happy, and sane over the next little bit. So thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.